Welcome to today's seminar at SNS. My name is Mikael Witteblad and I'm the head of the research program here at SNS. This seminar is part of a collaboration between the Institute for International Economic Studies at Stockholm University and SNS. The aim is to bring insights from leading international economists to the Swedish policy debate. The topic of today's seminar is tax evasion and inequality. How large is tax evasion at the international level and in Scandinavia? What are the effects of inequality in society? And how can tax evasion be reduced? We feel very honored to have the international leading economist in tax evasion, Gabriel Zucman, with us here today. Gabriel is an assistant professor at University of California, Berkeley. His research on international tax evasion has been published in several renowned journals. In 2017, Gabriel was given the Excellence Award in Global Economic Affairs at Kiel Institute for the World Economy. In 2014, he was given the French Economic Association Award for the best PhD thesis. Gabriel also published the book The Hidden Wealth of Nations, The Scourge of Tax Havens in 2015, which has been published in 17 languages. So a very warm welcome to Gabriel. Also, a warm welcome to Åsa Hansson, Associate Professor of Economics at Lunds University, and Per Krusell, Professor of Economics at the Institute for International Economic Studies at Stockholm University. I will now give the word to today's moderator, Robert Östling, Assistant Professor at IIES, Stockholm University.
So, hi, I am Robert. I will try to talk as little as possible to give as much time as possible to the speakers. So we'll start with Gabriel. He will do his talk. Then I will have a few questions for him. We will wait with questions for the audience after Gabriel, Åsa, and Per have given their talks. But there will be plenty of room for interaction. I know that a lot of people that have things to say about this topic. You can also go on Twitter. But if you do so, you should remember to keep your mobile phone in silent mode. The hashtag is SNS Kunskap. So now it's time for Gabriel. Please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here today. Thanks to the organizers, thanks to the discussants, and thanks to all of you for being here. So I'd like to talk about tax evasion and inequality. It's a joint work I've done with Annette Altatsater at the Norwegian University of Life Sciences and Niels Drensen at the University of Copenhagen. And so in that research, we ask a very simple question, which is how big is tax evasion in rich countries and how is it distributed? And this is an important question, I would say, for a number of reasons. The most important one is it's important for the study of inequality. Over the last 15 years, economists and people in the social sciences have increasingly relied on tax data to study the distribution of income and wealth, in particular long-run changes in income and wealth concentration. And in my view, it's a good move. It's a progress compared to earlier research that was mostly based on survey data, because with tax data, at least all rich people, they have to submit a tax return, whereas with only survey data, it's very hard to reach out to very wealthy individuals. However, there is one obvious problem with tax data is that, of course, the wealthy, they have incentives because they face higher marginal tax rates to understate their true economic resources, so either to do legal tax avoidance or in some cases illegal tax evasion. And in fact, it's the main reason why for a very long time tax data have been viewed with skepticism. Simon Kuznets, the Russian-born economist who moved to the US, was the one who pioneered the use of tax data to study inequality in the 1950s. But if you are in between Kuznets and Piketty and others in the early 2000s, almost nobody, with the notable exception of the late Tony Atkinson, picked up on the Kuznets agenda of using tax data precisely for that reason. People felt, it was hard to learn a lot about the income and the wealth of the rich by looking at tax data. The second reason why it matters, this question of tax evasion, is for tax policy and tax enforcement. So, of course, tax evasion, it redistributes the tax burden, it affects the cost of raising taxes. These are bread and butter concerns, of public economics. And the tax authorities, they face, they have limited revenue, they have budget constraints like everybody, and so they need to target, their enforcement efforts. They need to be somewhat strategic, and so they'd like to know who's more likely to evade taxes, and, in terms of revenue, what type of revenue loss, what type of tax evasion is more important. Now, the main problem in the literature is that it's hard to capture tax evasion at the top. So the way that tax authorities and researchers study tax evasion is by using several data sources, but the most important one and the highest quality is what is known as randomized audits. So tax authorities, not all of them, but in many countries, they have, a research program where they randomly audit taxpayers, and then they check tax returns, line by line to try to find traces of tax evasion. And that's how tax authorities estimate the tax gap. That is the amount of taxes owed which is not paid. And researchers have also used random audit studies to study tax evasion. And I want to clarify that random audits, tax authorities, of course, they not only do random audits, they also do a lot of non-random, targeted audits. The random audits is the research, part, if you want, of what tax authorities do. But it plays a critical role in our knowledge of tax evasion, and the problem is that with random audits, it's very hard to capture tax evasion by the wealthy for two reasons. One is that typically you have too few wealthy individuals who are sampled. Even if the audit samples a few rich people, you're going to have very few people with, say, $50 million in net wealth or $100 million. And the second thing is, in the context of a random audit, it's very hard to detect sophisticated forms of tax evasion that involve offshore banks, legal and financial intermediaries in many countries, just because the tax authority, they can cross-check that whatever wages are reported, corresponds to what was been earned. For instance, they can cross-check the use of deductions, but they can't ask all financial institutions all over the planet about whether this particular taxpayer has hidden wealth in Panama or in Hong Kong and so on. And so in practice, they don't find, they are just unable, and they that's something they recognize. It's not breaking news. They acknowledge that there is this problem, and so this means that random audit data, if you want to have a comprehensive view of tax evasion, they need to be supplemented with other data sources on evasion by the wealthy. But until now, it was very hard to have such data. I think there was just no micro data on tax evasion by wealthy individuals. What we do in this paper is that we analyzed, I think for the first time, data, microdata capturing tax evasion by very wealthy individuals. And the reason why we're able to do that is that we benefit from a number of developments. One is that over the last few years, there's been a number of leaks from big financial institutions. There were the Panama Papers last year. Before that, there was a Swiss leak from HSBC Switzerland. And the second thing is that over the last few years, there's also been a growing use of tax amnesties by very wealthy people, whereby tax evaders can voluntarily declare previously hidden assets. And so we are going to use these two data sources, leaks, tax amnesties, that we were able to match to individual level tax and administrative information in 3 countries, Sweden, Norway, Denmark. And then we are going to combine these new microdata with macroeconomic estimates of the amount of wealth held by Scandinavians in tax havens to try to estimate the amount of taxes that's evaded through tax havens and how this tax evasion is distributed. And the last step is that we're going to combine this with random audit studies to have a broad, picture of tax evasion. So the traditionally detected forms of tax evasion, as seen in random audits, plus these sophisticated forms of evasion at the very top. Now, I'd very much like to stress at the beginning that measuring inequality is hard. Measuring tax evasion is really hard. Measuring sophisticated forms of tax evasion by rich people through offshore financial institutions and shell corporations and trusts and foundations, that's extremely hard. Obviously, it's not a perfect science. We are never going to have absolutely fully precise and accurate answers to these questions. But I think with this data, we're able to make a little bit of progress in trying to approach what we think is likely to be the right order of magnitude. And what we find when we combine these different data sources is this graph. So that's a graph that shows for each group of the wealth distribution, bottom 10%, the next decile, all the way up to the top 0.01% richest households. For each group of the wealth distribution was the amount of taxes evaded divided by the amount of taxes owed. Okay? And so the average for, and that's for Scandinavian countries, pooling Norway, Sweden, Denmark, the macroeconomic average is about 3%. That is, we find about 3% of personal taxes owed are not paid. So this is a low overall level of evasion. However, we find a pretty steep gradient at the very top of the wealth distribution, with the tax gap, tax evasion rising to as much as 25-30% for the top 0.01% richest households. Now, what's the fundamental intuition for that result and the more conceptual reason why I think it's correct? The fundamental reason is that in a rich, advanced economies like Scandinavian countries, most people simply cannot evade taxes, because most people, they only earn 3 types of income over their lifetime: wages, dividends and interest and capital gains earned through domestic institutions, and pension income. And all these incomes, they are automatically reported to the tax authority, which makes tax evasion just impossible. And that's the reason why for the vast majority of the population, indeed, tax evasion rates are small. It's true that the self-employed, they can evade taxes, but as countries grow, as countries develop, the share of self-employment in total economic activity falls. And in Scandinavian countries today, it's very low, like it is in France, in the UK, in many other OECD countries, typically around 5, 6, 7% of GDP. So, just the what can be evaded by normal people is pretty limited. Of course, in countries like Greece, where the self-employed account for a bigger share of economic activity, you're going to have higher evasion rates, on average, and in all these groups. I don't quite think that this could reach 25% across the board. And of course, in developing countries, this could be, even higher across the board, because just more economic activity takes place in the the informal sector and among the self-employed. But in countries like Scandinavia and most OECD countries, that's, I think, an accurate picture. So that's why evasion overall is low. Why is it very high at the top? It's not because rich people are evil people. I think what's very important is to look not only at the demand for tax evasion, but also at the supply. The supply of tax evasion services, very concretely, it's some firms in the offshore world, in some law firms, some financial firms that just facilitate, that sell tax evasion services. And for those firms, what's optimal for them to do, you need to think about their business model. What's optimal for them to do is to have very wealthy customers, but a relatively small customer base. Very wealthy customers because then they're going to earn fees, let's say 1% of the wealth they help hiding. That's going to generate a lot of revenue if you help very rich people hide taxes, and relatively few customers because if you're too big, then the probability that a leak occurs or the probability that one of your customers is caught, doing tax evasion rises, and so that's bad for the business. So that's the main intuition. And now let me illustrate quickly some of the results. And let me start with what we learned from the HSBC Switzerland leak. So in 2007, there was this employee of HSBC Switzerland, Hervé Falciani, who leaked, who stole, the whole file of all the clients of this Swiss bank, so more than 30,000 clients. And, in many ways, it's like the best leak we could hope for. Because for a number of reasons, HSBC Switzerland was a big player in the Swiss wealth management business, probably among the top 10, maybe top 5, largest Swiss banks at the time of the leak, was managing more than $130 billion in net wealth. It had clients from all over the world. The available evidence suggests it was very representative of the Swiss banking industry at the time. There is no evidence in particular that it was the go-to place for Scandinavians to hide their wealth. We see that Scandinavians are as represented at HSBC Switzerland as they are in the other Swiss banks. There is actually good data published by the Swiss Central Bank on who owns wealth in Swiss banks. It's also great because it can be seen as a kind of random event. It's not the product of some enforcement initiative by governments. It's great because you can actually link the bank accounts to their owners. In many cases, in a vast majority of cases, actually, the bank accounts on paper, they belong to shell corporations in Panama, in BVI, and so on. But it turns out that the bankers, they kept note of who were the actual beneficial owners of these accounts. It's great because it also makes it possible to really identify illegal tax evasion from what is legal tax avoidance. So it's legal to have bank accounts all over the world, including in Switzerland, as long as these accounts are duly declared to tax authorities, and in particular, any income generated by the account is reported on the tax return. The wealth itself is reported if there is a wealth tax, and so by matching the list to tax returns, we can actually check whether that's the case, and in a vast majority of cases, 90-95%, that was not the case. So that was tax evasion. Okay, so what do we find? Very simple results. You do a simple computation where you rank people in Scandinavia, the entire population, by their net wealth, total assets, financial and non-financial, net of debts. And then for each group of the wealth distribution, you ask, what's the fraction of the population who appears in the HSBC leak? And so it's not a big surprise that people in the bottom 99% of the wealth distribution, very few of them had undeclared HSBC bank accounts, but at the very, very top 0.01%, people with more than $50 million in net wealth, find that 1% of the Scandinavians, at this wealth level, had undeclared HSBC Switzerland bank accounts. And, it's just one bank in just one tax havens, which according to the macroeconomic data that we have was managing about 2% of all the world's offshore wealth and was not, catering to Scandinavians in particular. So the high level of the probability at the top is pretty notable, and also the gradient, the fact that the higher up you move, up in the wealth distribution, the higher the probability to hide assets at HSBC, I think is interesting. Second thing is that you can ask, okay, for those who are hiding assets at HSBC, how much did they hide? And here we find that they hid about 40% of their total true net wealth, as far as we can estimate it. That is, these are very big amounts. On average, people with 100 million, they were hiding 40 million on these HSBC Swiss accounts. We also look at a more recent leak, the Panama Papers, which is more famous but in many ways less useful, because in particular we can't say in the Panama Papers whether there is tax evasion involved. That is, we see people who have shell companies in Panama, BVI and so on, who are able to match them to their tax returns, but there is less of a clear-cut test, and the investigations that are currently conducted by tax authorities, they are still ongoing. So this is a graph not about tax evasion. This is a graph about the use of tax havens across the wealth distribution. And what's striking is that, again, it's just one provider of shell corporations, but at the very, very top of the wealth distribution in Scandinavia, we see more than 1% of the richest households who appear in these Panama Papers leaked documents, and with, again, a very sharp gradient at the top. We can exploit what I think is actually the best data source, even though economists don't like it so much. I think it's the best one because it's actually the largest sample by far. These are individuals who've used tax amnesties to declare previously hidden assets. And in between 2008 and 2015, in Norway and Sweden, more than 8,000 people just came forward to the tax authority and said, yes, we were evading taxes. We were hiding assets, in Switzerland or Luxembourg and so on and so on. So it's great because we know that there is tax evasion. That's, by definition. It's great because you have relatively big sample sizes. Economists don't like this so much because they like to see selection problems, everywhere. And it's true that in principle, there is a potential selection issue, which is that you might imagine that only the wealthiest tax evaders self-select into tax amnesties. But in fact, selection could go the other way. You could imagine that only moderately wealthy individuals who've, for instance, inherited offshore accounts from their parents, who are not actively evading taxes, maybe only this type of individuals actually use tax amnesties. What is nice in our setting is that because we have this kind of random sample from HSBC, and then this sample where there is potentially self-selection that correlates with wealth, we can actually address this issue of whether there is a self-selection into tax amnesties based on wealth, whether wealthier tax evaders are more likely to use tax amnesties. And you can see visually by comparing this graph and this graph that both look very much the same. There is the same, gradient with wealth, which suggests that selection is actually a pretty small issue in that context. If anything, what you see is that here you have, these groups here of relatively moderately wealthy tax evaders, they are actually overrepresented in the amnesty data compared to the HSBC data, which suggests that if self-selection there is some moderate self-selection, but it's mostly self-selection that's negatively correlated with wealth. That is, less wealthy tax evaders are more likely to use tax amnesties than richer tax evaders. And despite this self-selection that means we in amnesty data tend to see relatively not super wealthy guys, we still find that 14%, think about this, 14% of the richest Scandinavians, as a matter of fact, over the last few years have just admitted doing, illegal tax evasion. So, that's a fact. Even if you don't believe in anything else, at least you have to acknowledge that apparently, even in countries with strong respect for the rule of law and that score very high on a number of international rankings on these issues, there is a bit of a problem when it comes to tax evasion at the very top of the wealth distribution. In both the HSBC and the Amnesty data, you see, and I think that was, to me, at least one of the main findings, you see that offshore wealth is extremely concentrated. That is, by our estimate, about 50% of the wealth held at HSBC and 50% of the wealth disclosed in amnesties belongs to the top 0.01% richest households. About 80%, you add these two dots here, belongs to the top 0.1% richest households. So it's true that, before the financial crisis of 2008-2009, Swiss banks had hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of customers. And so by that metric, tax evasion had become somewhat widespread. But when you look at the amounts, what really matters is the very top of the wealth distribution here. Now, what are going to be the implications of this for tax evasion and inequality? It very much depends on how big the total stock of offshore wealth is. And so recently, the Bank for International Settlements started to disclose some statistics that are imperfect in many ways on this, but we can use them to try to approach this question, try to estimate what's the amount of wealth that each country owns in tax havens globally. And I know I did previous work on trying to have such estimate for the world as a whole, and what I found was this horizontal line here that for the planet as a whole, there's about the equivalent of 10% of world GDP that's held in tax havens. But now we can estimate this statistic for each country. And what we find is Scandinavian countries here, Denmark, Norway, Sweden is a bit higher. Scandinavian countries, they're all below and even way below the world average. Okay, these are not the champions of tax evasion. Among the group of countries with a lot of offshore wealth, you have a few, oil-rich oil exporters in the Middle East for whom it's not a question of tax evasion. United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, it's more a question of wealth protection. For people in power. But you also have some actually old democracies, from continental Europe, like France, like the UK, like Belgium. So it's a diverse group. It's rare to see these different countries in the same bucket, if you want. And among the countries that have relatively little wealth offshore, what I find interesting is that you have both high tax countries, like Scandinavian countries, and low tax countries, like Korea and Poland, which among OECD countries are the lowest tax countries, which suggests that these things are far from being primarily driven by tax rates. Sometimes some people argue, I don't think there are very strong theoretical reasons for that tax evasion, is just a question of tax rates. The higher the tax rate, the more tax evasion. When you see these data, you realize that things are more complicated. And in particular, as I argued previously, what I think matters much more is the supply of tax evasion services. So the thing is, what's important is that even in countries like Norway, Sweden, Denmark, where the macroeconomic stock of offshore wealth is not so big, because it is hugely concentrated, with 80% of it belonging to the top 0.1% richest households, taking this into account is going to have relatively significant effects on inequality and on the long-run trends in inequality. So here I'm illustrating this with the case of Norway, where there is relatively good data on the long-run evolution of top wealth shares. Norway has been levying a wealth tax for a very long time. So based on published, tabulated tax statistics, we can try to construct this picture here. And what we see is that taking into account offshore wealth lifts by the top 0.01% wealth share by about 25% in recent years, so from 4% to 5%, and it makes some difference to the long run evolution of wealth concentration. I have to continue, but I'd be happy to talk more about the methodology underlying this graph, maybe in the questions. I'd like to talk about what this implies then for the size and distribution of tax evasion. So the way that we do that concretely is we have our macroeconomic stocks of offshore wealth. We see how offshore wealth tends to be distributed in several samples, HSBC, tax amnesties. So then we allocate these macro stocks, to the different groups of the population. And then we look at what's the rate of return on offshore wealth. And then we apply the tax law of the time. So all of these computations are for 2007 at the time of the HSBC leak. And when we do that, we find just this curve, this central scenario where people at the very top of the wealth distribution, we estimate they evade about 25% of their true tax liability through tax havens, at least at this time. Now you might say, okay, the main uncertainty in all of this, I don't think it's about how offshore wealth is distributed. I think it's likely that both the HSBC data, the amnesty data, they give the right order of magnitude. The main uncertainty is about the macro stock. You might say, I don't believe in these. I think Scandinavians have much less offshore wealth than you estimate. Now, it turns out we can have a lower bound for this because at least one tax haven is relatively transparent, publishes data on the amount of wealth that foreigners have in its banks, and I've already mentioned this. This is Switzerland, and so at least we have an observable data point for Switzerland. And so the lower bound here is just taking the wealth held only in Switzerland and disregarding the wealth held in all the other tax havens of Luxembourg, Caribbean tax havens, Asian, Hong Kong, Singapore, Channel Islands, and so on, Monaco, what have you. So even in this lower bound, we still have, relatively sizable rates of tax evasion, significantly higher than the macro average of 3%. Now, the higher scenario, which is not even an upper bound, but is a higher scenario, is one where we assume that Norway, Sweden, Denmark have the same stock of offshore wealth as the world average of 10% of GDP. So they use tax havens as much as the world on average. And so it's a way to think about how the curve would look like for a country that, is more representative of the world as a whole. And you see here tax evasion through tax havens becomes very high at the very top. Now we combine that with random audits. So that's a graph that shows the distribution of tax evasion in random audits. That's using the high quality Danish random audits that have already been used in some great research, in particular by Henry Cleven and co-authors. And what you see in random audits is about 2.3% of taxes owed are evaded. That's what the tax authorities estimate, with no clear trend, across the wealth distribution. In no wealth bin does evaded tax exceed 5% of taxes owed. And so then we can combine the two things, and that's the picture then that you get. That's just contrasting the distribution of tax evasion as seen in random audit data with the distribution of tax evasion through unreported hidden accounts. And so again, we think that the pink curve for random audits, it's far from perfect, but it's the best estimate we have of standard, relatively simple forms of tax evasion by the self-employed, by people who overstate their deductions and claim tax credits that they're not entitled to, and so on and so on. And then the blue curve is evasion at the very top. So of course, for most people, for most groups of the wealth distribution, it's about zero. As I already mentioned, the random audit data, they're mostly silent about what's happening within the very, very top groups. The sample sizes are just not big enough, so you just can't say anything about that. Here we're just assuming that within the very top bins, you have the same evasion rate as within the top 0.5% in general. And so now, if you combine these two curves, and you get, the first graph that I showed at the beginning of the lecture with the total tax evasion by wealth bin. One consequence of this is that because of tax evasion, the results we have suggest that the tax system is significantly less progressive than what the tax law implies. What the tax law implies is that you have a tax system that's progressive, with average tax rates here rising with wealth and kind of stabilizing or maybe rising a tiny bit at the very top. That's taking into account all taxes on personal income and payroll and wealth when they exist at all levels of government. Now, if indeed very rich people evade around 25-30% of their taxes, then in reality what happens, is that at the very top of the wealth distribution, the tax rate actually falls a lot. And so some reactions I have sometimes is, it's still great news, that rich people are still paying 30% in taxes, and that's quite a lot. We thought that in a globalized world, they had managed to pay like 5% or 10%. And well, you can see it this way. You can also see the other way, which is that if indeed globalization means, declining tax progressivity like that at the very, very top of the wealth distribution. So we're talking about people who here in this top group have more than $50 million in net wealth. It is a bit hard to understand how this is going to continue, of course, because if it means that it's easier and easier for rich people to pay little in taxes, and collecting more taxes is not a goal in itself, and collecting more taxes on the wealth is not a goal in itself, but the taxes that are not paid there, they have in some form, in some sense, they need to be compensated for by higher taxes for the rest of the population, or lower public spending, or more public debt. And so it's a bit hard to see how this can be accepted for a very, very long time. All right, I'm going to be very quick on that because this is easy, and then I'll conclude. So one question that I think is interesting and that we can shed some light on is, if rich people evade taxes, what would happen if tax evasion became impossible? Is it the case that governments would be able to collect more revenue from the very rich? And that very much depends on the interplay between tax evasion and tax avoidance. You can imagine that, we shut down, Swiss banks and Panama, shell corporations, but what's going to happen is that the people who use these things, they are now going to move towards legal forms of tax avoidance in such a way that maybe there will be no extra taxes collected on these individuals. And so we look at what happened when people used tax amnesties in Norway. So they used to hide a lot of wealth. We've seen that. They decide to come clean. Do they start avoiding more? Well, that's the number of people who use the tax amnesty in Norway every year. Now, that's just one graph that shows that when they use the tax amnesty, they start reporting much more wealth to the tax authority. Typically, reported wealth increases by 60%. Okay, that's consistent with what I showed previously on what fraction of their wealth people were hiding. So there's a big jump in reported wealth. There is a big jump in reported taxable income. And that's the key result. There is a big jump in the taxes they pay. And what's more important is that this jump in the taxes they pay is permanent. At least 4 years after they've used the tax amnesty, they still pay 20-30% more in taxes than they used to before using the amnesty, which suggests that at least over this time period of 4 years, they've not been substituting aggressively towards tax avoidance. And indeed, we've looked at lots of indicators, lots of forms of tax avoidance, for rich people in the Norwegian context, creating holding companies, invested in unlisted securities, and so on. And we've not seen any evidence that they substitute aggressively towards tax avoidance. And so it's a kind of a message of hope, which is that I think if you come back to this notion that the supply of evasion services is important, you understand that there is some scope for policy. You can curb the supply by making it very costly for providers of tax evasion services to do this, by saying, for instance, financial institutions who are going to be found facilitating financial crimes, we're going to systematically, automatically put them out of business. We're going to withdraw their banking licenses. So with such a policy, the supply would shrink, tax evasion at the top could shrink a lot. I think it could be raised. I think it's totally possible. And this combined with these results on amnesty data. I'm not claiming that amnesties are great tax policy, but at least in that context, that shows that it's possible. At least that's one example that shows it's possible to collect more taxes on extremely wealthy individuals without changing the tax law, just by better enforcing taxes. And that's my last slide. I want to stress again that measuring tax evasion and its distribution involves uncertainties. My hope is that there will be more studies like that in other countries. And I'm hopeful that this will happen because the data actually exists. So in particular, think about the amnesty data. Most countries have amnesties, and the data are in the tax authorities. The HSBC data, it also exists because the French tax authority who obtained the leak, shared it with many countries' tax authorities. The Panama Papers, they are online. So all of this could be used, implemented in REACH, in other OECD countries, and also in developing countries to construct distributional tax gaps. And the ultimate goal is to correct global inequality statistics so as to better measure the true wealth of the very rich. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Gabriel. This is super interesting. I think this is very useful research to know more about how much taxes are evaded and who are evading these taxes. So I think in the discussions we will jump relatively quickly to policy questions and normative questions. But before we do that, I have a question more about the details, the descriptive issues. The main finding in this paper is that it's really the very rich that evade wealth taxes by putting them offshore. So that conclusion relies on, in the end, it boils down to a few hundred people that are in these leaks. And you're extrapolating from that. By the way, first of all, I should say, your finding makes sense to me. I cannot believe in it, but still, if I put my doctoral hat on, I see that there's just a few hundred people that you're extrapolating from. And let me give you a short anecdote that I remember from my childhood, that there was this book around at home called by Roger Achelius. So Roger Achelius, does anyone remember him? He's now a wealthy man living in Bahamas, but actually giving away most of his fortune. But in the 80s, he wrote books about how to avoid taxes. And I know in other countries, people are interested in soccer, they talk about soccer and politics. I think my sense of the 80s is that many people were interested in tax avoidance. So his book on how to avoid taxes sold hundreds of thousands of copies during the 80s. And then in the late 80s, and this was a time where capital tax and income tax were paid jointly and progressively. So it was very high taxes on capital. And then to the end of the 80s, he started a bank in Cyprus. And I think he got 160,000 Swedish customers that put in some money. I think he actually targeted kind of relatively ordinary people. So how sure can you be that there are not more guys like him out there that kind of attract other people? Right?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think what I want to stress is that we look at the HSBC data, and indeed it's a sample of 520 tax evaders, and most of them very rich. I think compared to the size of Scandinavian countries, it's significant compared to the sample sizes of rich people studied in random audits. It's huge. In random audits, you have literally zero or maybe 5 tax evaders, at these levels of wealth. So I think it's a progress compared to that. However, and I did not talk about standard errors, but all these graphs that I showed you, the gradient that you see, for instance, in the HSBC distribution, that's the probabilities to evade taxes are statistically different from each other. more important than all of that is the amnesty data. The amnesty data, is important because it shows very similar pattern than the HSBC leak, but not just on a much bigger scale, because the sample size here is 10 times bigger. It's much bigger, and in this amnesty data, where I think there are relatively good reasons to believe that relatively not too wealthy individuals are more likely to self-select. Even despite that, you still see, the gradient that I showed. So I agree with you that dozens of thousands of relatively of people with 1, 2 million, or maybe $500,000, or maybe $3 million, sometimes evade taxes. But just in terms of the size, the mass of people at these wealth levels, these are not big, so big numbers. These are big in absolute terms, but relatively to the number of people in the population who have 1 million, 2 million, it's not so big. What's more striking is that people, who have more than 50 million, who are few in numbers, for them, the probability either to appear in the amnesty, to appear in the Panama Papers, to appear in the HSBC leak is very high. Right. That was the main finding. Right.
Yeah, so you're right. It's very few. So I think the top 0.01%, that's 1,000 people in Sweden. We're 10 million. So I mean, you're right. We can go and play golf with most of them if we had time to do so. Okay, so I will give, if they agree to play golf with us, of course.
What you're saying is important because you might have time, but who really has time and plays golf with them is the bankers. That's how, it's the providers of tax evasion services. That's how it works. They have these events, golf events, galas, where they target very, very rich clients. So that's exactly how it works. Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much. So now it's time for Åsa Hansson. As Mikael said before, she's associate professor of economics in Lund, and she's just now finishing the 2018 SNS report, which will be on wealth inequality and capital taxation, if I'm not mistaken.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here, and it's an honor to be able to discuss this important topic. And I think this paper is a big contribution, and the strength that you're using so many different data sets, and you find basically the same result. So my comments are mainly just questions and some comments. So I was also surprised when I read your paper that the extent of tax evasion in Sweden is quite low. So you find that in Scandinavia, approximately 1.6% of the total wealth is held in tax havens. And compared to the world average, that's 3.3, so it's about half, which is surprisingly low, I would think. And also that it's the top, as we have discussed previously. And as you also said, it's very hard to measure this. And typically people talk about it being underestimated. But I think there is at least one reason why it could also be overestimated. And that's because of this base effect. If you face lower taxes, then you're going to get a higher return, so your wealth will grow faster. So in that sense, you could argue that maybe the wealth that's held in tax havens is actually a grower than the wealth would have been if it had stayed domestically. And I think it's really hard to disentangle those effects. And I have myself worked on tax evasion among MNEs, multinational firms, and there's the problem that you pick up too much, because when the taxes are lower, more investments become profitable, so the base grows. So then my interest is obviously in why does this happen, and does it affect inequality? And as you also said, inequality, how do you measure that? And what is it that's really relevant? Because I'm going to show some graphs on Sweden later on here. Is it the amount of capital? Because it's true that the amount of capital has grown in the world. But it's not so true when you look at the return to capital, because when capital goes up, then the return to capital goes down. So if you look at the income share of capital, the inequality is not as doesn't look as bad as when you look at the stock, the amount of capital. So what is it that's really relevant? Is it the amount of capital you have? Or is it the return you get from this capital? And also what's causing the capital to grow? And we've been looking at, for writing this report for SNS, which is dealing with capital and taxation in the future. There's a lot of evidence indicating that there's two effects, two causes of the growth of capital. One is for property, and I think that's really true in Sweden, and mainly, or at least to a certain degree, due to the tax reform in 2008, when we reduced the property tax and kept the interest deduction. So it's the property that made us richer in capital, and also that the stock returns have increased, mainly due to globalization. So it's all linked to ownership. So if you owned something, either property or stocks, then you're wealthier today than you were previously. And also that you are facing a very low interest rate, which by definition is going to increase the stock of capital. But this wealth is not realized, most of it. It's still held, so it could also easily vanish. And I think now in Sweden there's a lot of talk about what's happening on the property market, and people are getting nervous. So they might be very rich, but they could quickly not be so very rich anymore. So that's like an issue. And then going back to this first comment about why there's so little evasion in Scandinavia, and one, I think there's a lot of reasons for that. I think maybe we do have a higher tax morale and it's harder to evade. But it could also be, at least to a certain degree, that we have actually very low taxes on wealth. Sweden is known to be a high-tax country, and that's true for income, but it's not true for the stock. So this is like a wider measure of wealth. So it includes property, wealth, inheritance, and like transfer taxes. And if you rank OECD countries, Sweden ranks quite far down. And at the top, you have, if I remember your picture where you looked at the tax evasion where it was above average, it tended to be the countries that are to the left here. France, Germany, Canada, Belgium. That they tend to have high taxes on the stock, on wealth, which also makes it more interesting then to evade taxes than in Sweden. And it's also true that the data you have is from 2006, if I'm correct. So it's interesting to see what's going on today. Is it more widely spread and more common? And if we look at the inequality, Gini coefficients. So this is Gini coefficient for Sweden from 2000-2012. And obviously wealth, so the blue line is wealth, and that's the most unevenly distributed. It has the highest Gini coefficient. And it has increased a bit. But if you look at labor income, which is the green line, that's been pretty stable. And if you look at disposable income, so income after taxes, what you can consume, the distribution is quite low. We have a quite low Gini coefficient. And you don't see really any big increases in those. And again, going back to the difference between the return to capital and the stock of capital, if you look at the capital share, so this is, if you look at aggregate income, how much of that income is capital income and how much is labor income. And the blue line is Sweden, and the range from 1980 to 2015. I mean, it's hard to say whether there's a trend or not, but you don't see an upward trend at least. If anything, it's maybe stable or maybe a little bit declining. So that means that the return to capital has declined as capital become more affluent, then the return goes down. So there's, and then the question is, what is it that's relevant? Is it the amount of capital or how much you actually make from this capital? But obviously there is this issue of inequality, and that's something that is potentially a problem. So then the next question is, what do we do about this? And as you find that it's a very wealthy that evades taxes, then it's unfortunately also the case that it's this group that is the most sensitive to taxes. So they have the the most means and are more able to avoid taxes than other groups. And if you look at the optimal income taxation literature, there's actually like a famous result from the optimal income taxation saying that the top income earner, or the top, actually it's ability guy, should face a zero marginal tax rate. And as you show that the taxes actually are regressive, going down for the very wealthy. I mean, they could, if you argue from the optimal income taxation, they actually should face lower taxes. And the alternative, if they face higher taxes, would be that they maybe move out of the country. And then we lose that 65% of the revenues that they are now at least bringing into the country. And then there's a lot of work going on the increased exchange of information, which I think is has helped a lot. And that's good. But it's still the case that research shows that if there are countries that are not part of this agreement, then the capital relocate to those countries. So it's important that everybody participates. And there's also very strong incentives not to participate. The more countries that participate in these agreements, the stronger are the incentives for some countries not to participate, because then they're going to attract all the capital. So that's the main problem. And you can't really force anybody to go into these agreements. You can make it unpleasant, maybe. But if you look at the development, it's actually been there's been a dramatic increase in number of agreements. But then you also need to remember that there's always a cost. There's always like a benefit, but there's always a cost too. And there is a cost of this exchange of information. I think a lot of Americans are aware of the cost with the FATCA, the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Account. Act. Sorry, that was not so good. I got two right. FNA. Where you tax on worldwide income, you have to report. So all financial institutions have to report to the U.S. tax authority if they do business with Americans. And obviously, this exchange of information and also what's levied on businesses has a high transaction cost, which makes it less profitable for capital to be mobile. And then since I'm a tax economist, I couldn't help but thinking about the optimal punishment when it comes to taxation. And there's a saying that the optimal punishment is hanging taxpayers with probability zero. And what does that mean? So it means that it's costly to audit, and it's costly to find evaders. But if the punishment is so harsh, that's going to deter you from doing the act. So if you hang taxpayers, you don't really audit very many, but the ones you find, you're going to hang them. Then that's the optimal punishment. I mean, this is like an economist speaking. Lawyers and human rights activists might not agree. But if the punishment is severe, and I think there's also like a social stigma. So I think these leaks are really good for bringing down the evasion. And that journalists could do a lot here to hang out and make it, maybe not hang taxpayers, but make it unpleasant to do it. So just to sum up, so we talked a lot about tax planning for individuals. We shouldn't remember that there's also a lot of tax planning going on in other areas that could even be bigger than tax evasion for individuals. I mean, there is all the work on the BEPS, the base erosion and profit shifting. That one I remembered. Among multinational firms within Europe, it's estimated to be a loss in 50 to 70 billion euros. And there's a lot of work trying to tame that. There's also something that we don't really talk very much about. We talk a lot about individuals, we talk a lot about M&Es. We don't talk so much about the VAT gap. There's actually even more avoided from the VAT, from cross-border transactions. So it's estimated that 12% of the VAT revenues are actually lost due to fraud, evasion, and avoidance. So I think the main take-home message here is that we have a tax system that's designed for national economies, living in a more closed environment, and the reality today is that we live in a globalized world. So maybe it's time to look into the overall tax system and see if we can somehow adjust the tax system so that it's more in sync with the globalized world. Because we also need to remember that having capital mobility is something that is desirable. So making it too costly and making the administration cost of this, of trying to mitigate tax evasion, we don't want to harm like the tax mobility that's driven by economic forces. But we do want to try to mitigate tax planning, obviously, and tax evasion. But it's important to keep in mind that there is always a cost when you're doing something. You need to compare that to the benefits. And if the evasion is not as great, I mean, I think today maybe it would be interesting to know how much it is today compared to what you find for 2006. But I'm going to end there. So those are some of like my questions. And but thank you. I found it very interesting and very important work. So thank you.
So thank you, Åsa. It's time for Per, and Gabriel, you will get the chance to comment after Per's presentation. So. And Per is a professor in economics. He's one of Sweden's leading macroeconomists, and is one of my colleagues. And also on the board on SNS, I think.
That's correct.
Yes.
Which reminds me that I should say that the introduction of Robert mentioned that you were an assistant professor at our institute. And you were, but you are no longer. You're an associate professor. And I take credit because I was part of the group deciding that. But I'm sure you will be a professor within soon. So, okay. Thanks a lot for inviting me to comment on this work. My background: I am a macroeconomist. That's correct. But actually, a lot of my research has been about inequality in general, and focused, I guess, mostly recently, at least, on the United States. So that's my background. I'll get back, ask a couple of general questions. I have no presentation. Let me first just give my instinct reaction to this, which is reminded me of a TV program about doping of cross-country skiers. There was a sort of a scandal when they discovered that they had individual measures of blood, particular aspects of blood, how they changed a lot for individuals, like right before the Olympics and right before the World Cup and so on. And they had individual tests, but of course they couldn't accuse anyone and say or prove that they actually used doping. And so it was similar in that they saw it there very clearly, and it was somehow an outrage because now it's there. So many skiers at the same time cannot have their blood levels just jump up right before the competition. So it's a bit like this. You also have individual data, and but here you could sort of, I guess you can pin them and say you did this. You also see that it's the richest, or like the top people somehow, and I guess that was also the case I cross-country ski. I'm not very good. I'm far below average. I never tried doping, and it's a bit similar to the tax story here. So, and I think it would be interesting to actually follow this over time. In the case of doping, there are technological advances making it possible to do it, but also to detect it. And in terms of like understanding the growth of wealth inequality, I think I wonder, what the effect of the internet is and various technological changes. You only showed one graph, which was the one of Norwegian data, and it looked pretty smooth. But there is an open question as to why U.S. wealth inequality has gone up so much. That's one of the questions I've been studying, and your work makes me wonder if the changes in the propensity to evade can have been driven by technological factors. So much happened in the 70s, 80s, 90s so it would be interesting to hear if you had anything to say on that. But my general question is something that I think is an important determinant of wealth inequality and wealth accumulation, which is the question of how the very richest behave in some general sense. I mean, you touched on how they behave in terms of tax avoidance or tax evasion. But there's also like the broader question of how to what extent do they accumulate wealth differently than the rest of us? So the question is, are they just like the rest of us but with more money? When you try to understand why wealth inequality is huge, kind of in most countries, and including in Sweden, I mean, you saw the numbers. The Gini coefficient was like almost hitting 1, the one you showed us. It's hard to understand that data without some notion that the richest people accumulate wealth at somehow higher rates. They have a higher propensity to not consume their money. I mean, if you gave me $10 million, I would consume it. Not all of it, but we can discuss what I would do. But if you give $10 million to people at the top, they will save most of it. That's kind of, I think, an important determinant. And then the question is, why are they different? And I think when we're thinking about wealth accumulation and also tax evasion, like what drives them? And I know that's not your question right here, but it is a very, very important question in the background. So it would be interesting to hear that. And I should also mention that in my research on U.S. wealth, the rise in U.S. wealth inequality, the broad conclusion is that there could be many explanatory factors, but it seems to us so far the most important factor is that taxes were lowered in a big way around the Reagan. When Reagan came into office, taxes were lowered across the board in a huge way, and they were kept low. I mean, there's still kind of the Reagan effect is still there. There hasn't been a reversal, and that's just a massive, massive impact on wealth inequality, making wealth spread more and more. And unless that lowering of taxes will be reversed, our predictions are that the tax or wealth inequality will continue to spread. And, one could discuss pros and cons and, to what extent, there are costs and benefits, like Åsa said, and so on. But in terms of the main determinants is that. And your graph kind of indicates that at the very top, taxes are much lower than right before the top, and they are at the same level as in the rest of the population. So I think it can be, suppose you get more and more possibilities to avoid taxes, that can be an important reason why you see all of this. And so then the question is, and I guess you didn't quite ask it, but what should we do now? What do you think are that's my closing question. And what types of taxation are appropriate if you want to try to get the level of taxation up? Should we go back to the wealth tax? And I don't know if you know the case of Sweden. We had it, we discontinued it in 2007. But there's also an interesting observation there, which is that in 1997 there was some sort of tax deal by the then Social Democrat, meaning the left bloc in the political spectrum, and somehow the richest owners of companies, that they would not have to pay this tax, but others did. But it's kind of an interesting thing that now is not relevant because we don't have that tax anymore. But makes me think that why was there such a deal? And maybe there's some people in the room who can reflect on that. But there seems to be strong resistance to that type of tax. So the comparison between different possible taxes would be interesting to hear your thoughts on. That's it.
Thank you, Per. So can we have all three of you up there? So first, Gabriel. So can we have all three of you up there? So I promise we will end exactly, no later than past. So Gabriel, there were a lot of questions for you. I have a long list as well, but I'm not going to ask them. So you have to choose a little bit about what you want to respond to.
Right. Thank you very much for your comments. Now, these are all great questions. Maybe let me start with the last question that you asked. To me, it's true that globalization is putting a lot of pressure on tax systems and is changing the ability of governments to levy income and wealth taxes and to redistribute. So there are two possible approaches. One is to say, okay, we take that as given, and so we cut taxes on the wealthy and on multinational corporations, and we try, all of us, Sweden, France, and so on, to become tax havens, of some sort. Okay, that's one approach. My feeling is that it's not really politically viable. I maybe I'm biased because I live in the US under Trump, but my feeling is that the outcome of this is Trumpism, is people realizing that it's just not working for us, the economy. If rich people and big multinationals pay less taxes and governments internalize this by cutting taxes further, abolishing the wealth tax, the inheritance tax, the property tax, moving to flat rates on capital income, and like Sweden has done, while at the same time compensating for this by having a higher, VAT or income tax on retirees and working class and middle class people. I don't see a bright future to this strategy. So that's why I believe more in the other strategy, which is I think it's possible to adapt the tax system to the reality of globalization. In the case of multinational companies, there's a very simple fix, which is to change the way we compute profits taxable in each country by apportioning global profits proportionally to where sales are made, for instance. In the case of the wealth tax, I think it's doable if you receive more information from tax havens, which is exactly what's happening right now with the automatic exchange of bank information, huge progress. And if you have stronger sanctions on the suppliers of tax evasion. That's really the main thing I strongly believe in, is that it's possible to dramatically reduce tax evasion if you make it unprofitable for those who facilitate it. So I am not in favor of hanging tax evaders, but I'm in favor of having big sanctions for financial and law firms that make it easy. And I think it is totally feasible. There's been a tiny bit of progress on these issues with, the US imposing more fines over recent years. I still think it's far from enough. Typically, the fines are too small, way too small in many cases compared to the profits of these big financial institutions. There are complicated issues, which is the trade-off that regulators face is that they're very afraid of indicting systematically important institutions, because then they're afraid that this would have destabilizing effects on global financial markets. If you say to UBS or Credit Suisse or HSBC, game over, you're facilitating money laundering by Mexican drug cartels through your US subsidiaries. That's just basic massive financial crimes that we're not going to tolerate, and we're going to withdraw your US banking license. They could have done that. Instead, they said, no, we're going to fine you $2 billion, which at a time when HSBC made $20 billion in profits. And the problem is that if big financial firms become too big to indict, then you're in real trouble, because then fines are a cost of doing business. They include that in their business plan, and tax evasion could continue, and money laundering could continue. So that is a serious issue, but that's where the debate should be, in my view. I very much tend to view these things as questions of financial regulation in many ways, and I think the limitation of the automatic exchange of bank information, which indeed is a very important development, is that we are only relying, if you want, on the goodwill of offshore financial institutions. So we are politely asking bankers in Switzerland, in the Cayman Islands, to please, tell us about your customers. Please help us enforce taxes. And what we've learned, I think, over the last decade following the financial crisis is that many people in the financial industry are honest people and will abide by the law, but also there is, at least in some segments of the financial industry, a deep cultural problem where people think that as long as you make money, you're doing good for the world, even if it means breaking the law for, labor, for mortgages, for tax evasion, for money laundering. You've had tons of cases where just banks have clearly violated the law. And tax evasion is part of this bigger problem of better regulating the financial industry, in my view. And if we make progress on that, then I think the prospects for having wealth taxation and capital income taxation are actually pretty good. I think it's totally possible to enforce these taxes, conditional on what I've just mentioned. And I think it's important because I very much agree with you that indeed when you look at the data, the models, the type of evidence that exists, it's clear that the big decline in taxation at the top of the distribution in the US has been a major driver of the rise of income and wealth inequality. And now we know, in 2017, we know kind of what's the outcome of this, at least politically speaking. And if we could avoid having that in Europe, it would be great. If we could avoid having global Trumpism, that would be valuable, I think. The problem is Sweden, for instance. I'm struck by the fact that Sweden has gone in a pretty extreme way in this detaxing of wealthy individuals, abolishing the wealth tax, abolishing the inheritance tax, abolishing the property tax, having flat taxes on capital income. It's a radical move, and the truth is that it takes a lot of time before the effects materialize. Something that's particularly striking in my view is that the Tax Reform Act of 1986 in the US, which led, under Reagan to the very, the top marginal income tax rates on income of 28%, so the low watermark in the US. They used to be 90% in the 60s, 70s. In 86 is the historical minimum. After Tax Reform Act of 86, top rate of 28%. This was voted by 97 senators out of 100, including Joe Biden, Al Gore, including Kennedy, including many Democrats who played then a prominent role, in political life in the Democratic Party. So there was a huge consensus at the time, for saying this is great. This is the way to go. 28% tax rates on the wealthy. And it takes 30 years, for 20, 30 years for the effects to materialize completely. And at that time, it's too late. So that's my concern, I think, for some European countries. There can be a strong consensus at some point in time for detaxing the wealthy, but you need to kind of take the long view. And my hope is that at least we have the US example that gives us some guidance about what can happen when you go in that direction in such an extreme way.
So thank you. So we should open up for some questions from the audience. I think please wait for a microphone and introduce yourself when you ask the question.
Thank you. My name is Henrik von Sydow at the Carnegie Investment Bank. I'm a former chairman of the Committee on Taxation in the Swedish Parliament. Thank you very much for your presentation. And an interesting destruction of Sweden as a tax haven when it comes to capital income tax here. As I understand you, the main reason for tax evasion is the supply of tax evasion services. That's the main reason. And you say it has nothing to do, or at least little to do, with the tax design and the tax levels. But one obviously argument against this is that the supply of tax evasion services is highly connected, of course, to the design of the tax system and the level of the tax system. For example, and you already commented on it, but what would happen for the demand in Sweden for tax evasion services if you, example, introduced a new wealth tax or a tax on inheritance?
I mean, if there's no supply, then there's no market, right? So even if there's a big demand, if there's no supply, there's not going tax evasion at the very top. That I think we can all agree on. If we reduce the supply to 0%, even if rich people want to evade, they are not going to be possible. So
that's actually what you're suggesting.
I think that's the main way to fight tax evasion, is to reduce the supply to 0%.
So we have another question there.
Thank you. My name is Per Wiese and I work at the Swedish House of Finance at the Stockholm School of Economics. I want to ask you about avoiding taxes by leaving the country. There is a lot of talk in Sweden right now about pensioners moving to Portugal because there is no tax on paying out pension for Sweden. And there are more reasons for Swedes to move to Portugal than taxes. There are great golf courses and it's a better climate. But it's somehow a growing phenomenon, and has been a tension. And I think in France, after Hollande introduced the wealth tax, I mean, there was at least media reporting about wealthy Frenchmen moving to Belgium and Gérard Depardieu moving to Moscow and what have you. Are these sort of phenomena of any quantitative importance, or is it sort of primarily anecdotes that we sort of like to read about?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. There's not a lot of evidence on the international mobility of high earners or even retirees. So in France, we've had a wealth tax for a pretty long time, since 1981. It's probably going to be abolished next year, this year actually. Then the tax authority tries to track, the number of wealth tax payers who leave the country and those who return. And as far as we know, the flows are actually not very big. It's a few hundred wealth taxpayers who leave the country every year. And it doesn't seem to be huge. I mean, there's a need for much more research on that question. I don't myself, know what's the correct, the exact order of magnitude. But at least if we believe that evidence, it seems less of an issue, at least historically speaking, than the problem of staying in Paris or staying in France close to your business, which is important, if you want to manage a business, but then using offshore financial services to avoid or to evade taxes. Now, that might change in the future. And then it becomes a question of tax harmonization within the EU. Can we agree on a set of good practices? And I mean, we have to think about the trade-off. If the temptation is big for each country, be it Sweden, be it France, be it Portugal, to become a bit of a tax haven in its own way. So Portugal is going to be, let's be a tax haven for retirees. Sweden now is, in many ways for rich people. So there is this temptation. Can we collectively find ways to put limits on these temptation, because we need to think about the risks, which I think are real.
So, Åsa, you
I
wanted
just
to
wanted
comment?
to say something about this movement of people. It's true that there's not so much research on mobility and how that's affected by taxation, but there is a little bit coming up now with the very, very rich, like professional football players, entrepreneurs, and like the top income earners. And unfortunately, they find that the elasticity is greater than 1, so they are sensitive to taxation. So that's why I am kind of hesitant to wealth tax and national wealth tax, because I think we would drive out the very, very rich. So there is some evidence, but there's much more that needs to be done.
Can I just add just a quick point on that? So I agree with you. There is this paper on mobility of footballers. That's totally true. What I think is important from a more policy perspective is these elasticities. We know that, in public economics, these are not things that are exogenous. These are not, parameters that are here and forever and cannot change. These are things that can be affected by policies. So, with policy, you can reduce the elasticity with coordination, with exchange of information, with tax harmonization. You can reduce these elasticities, and the goal of policies in tax policy in a globalized world, in my view, should be to try to do this. How do we make the tax bases less elastic, rather than saying, "Oh, they're very elastic, hence tax rates must be zero"? I think it's very important.
I mean, it's true. It's affected by policy.
So we soon have to end, but we have one last question from the audience, and then we'll wrap up.
Thank you. Bertil Wiman, Uppsala University. You haven't defined tax evasion, tax avoidance. I mean, they seem to be starting points that are crucial for your research, and I think that would be useful because some of the solutions you propose, for instance, to have rules deterring tax supplier of tax advice would be linked to how you define these kind of concepts, and I think that is very difficult to define, and you would get as many answers as you have countries involved. I also like to underscore what Åsa has described of the history of Sweden, and also Henrik, because a lot of the Swedish tax evaders, they started in the 70s in a very, very different tax climate, in a climate where the politicians threatened by nationalizing their assets. So there is a risk that when you use data that stems from that old time, and now from 2006, to have solutions for 2018, when we have quite efficient exchange of information, a very different tax climate, and less threat of nationalization or expropriation. I think there's a danger in drawing conclusions based on old data. And I should say I'm a lawyer and I'm not an economist, so forgive me for getting into your area.
No, I agree with you. I'd like to have more up-to-date data, more current data, and I hope, and I'm optimistic that there will be more research, and the automatic exchange of bank information is just starting now, so it's going to be assessed, in the years to come, whether it's going to work or not. Let's see the data. I mean, historically, we've tried a number of things to foster more cooperation from Swiss bankers. We had the European Union Saving Tax Directive. It's been a total failure. We had the Qualified Intermediary Program in the US. It's been a failure because in all cases, what Swiss and other offshore bankers did is they, moved their clients behind shell companies, and they said, look, we don't have Swedish clients, we don't have American clients, so we don't send information, we don't collect taxes. So maybe the automatic exchange of bank information will work better. Just let's see what the data show, and I'm very much looking forward to studying this and to seeing more studies on these issues. Now, for the question on tax evasion versus tax avoidance, I beg to disagree. I think we have a very clear distinction, and it's at the heart of the paper, about evasion and avoidance. So illegal evasion is you earn income that you don't report on your tax return and that you should report. And that we can see it very clearly because we see the accounts at HSBC Switzerland, we see the income generated on those accounts, and then we look at the tax data, is the income there or is it not there? And same for the wealth tax. So it's really, I can't think of a clearer way to identify tax evasion. It is black and white. And we are looking only at people who are taxable in Sweden or Norway or Denmark. So we exclude non-residents. It's true in our data we see a lot of people, not a lot, but dozens of cases of people who have, for instance, Swedish nationality, but they are living outside of the country. They live in Switzerland or they live elsewhere, and so they are not, even though they they have data in the administrative system, they are not taxable in Sweden and so on. And these people we exclude from our analysis. We are taking into account people who are taxable in Scandinavia, for instance in Sweden, who as such they have to pay taxes on their worldwide income, and they don't. So that's clear. And then we have a big part of the analysis which is precisely looking at the interplay between illegal tax evasion and legal tax avoidance. And remember, a key data that we use is tax amnesty data, where people come forward and they say, yes, we were evading taxes. We ask for an amnesty. It's not we were avoiding, but we're asking you not to jail us, because nobody goes to jail for tax avoidance. Nobody has to pay penalties for tax avoidance. This is amnesty data, which by definition is tax evasion, and then we look at the interplay between evasion and avoidance. So I strongly disagree with the statement that we don't make a good distinction. It is really at the heart of our analysis.
So I promised that we should end on time, so I'll give the last word to Mikael, and then we close the session for today.
Yes, this marks the end of today's seminar. On the behalf of SNS, I would like to thank Gabriel, Åsa, Per, and Robert for an interesting discussion with an applause.